Okay, today we're going to start 5.1 Introduction to Memory. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to compare and contrast the various cognitive processes. In other words, the ways that we process and then store that information. Okay, so memory is learning. Oh, let me put the pad on. There we go. Sorry, learning that has persisted over time. So not something that just happened one time, but something that's happened multiple times. And the way memory works is what we call the information processing model. And so we think that memory happens in essentially 3 phases. The first is encoding, which is we get the information into the brain. And then storage is keeping it there. And retrieval is getting it out. Now, one of the cool things about our memory is to some extent, we can have parallel processing and dual processing, meaning that you can be listening to this, the lesson, and recognize the temperature in the room. So your brain can do 2 things at once. Now, I want to be careful with this because it cannot play video games and study at the same time, or listening to some types of music can be ineffective. Because what's happening is it's preventing that information from being stored properly. So you have to be careful when we talk about parallel processing and dual processing. It just means that your brain can take in different types of information at the same time. It doesn't mean that it stores it. We form memories in 3 ways. So after we go through that process, while we are going through that process, there are 3 ways to store that information, according to the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. And I'm going to show you a picture of this here in a second. The first way is sensory memory. So this is all sensations. Come through. This is for a second, right? It doesn't last for very long. It's just your body processing all sensations, smells, sounds, all of that information. Short-term memory is you take small amounts for a few seconds. So think about a phone number or a locker combination. You can remember it. If somebody they say about 7 digits is what you can remember. Long-term memory is when you store the information for retrieval later. Now, if we take a look at this chart right here, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see that properly here. There we go. Okay, so if we take a look at this chart right here, the modified 3-stage processing model of memory, we have this sensory memory that you see right here, and that is all these external events. So anything that your brain can capture or process from any certain moment of time. In this case, if you're at a game, you might see a bunch of faces. So it goes into your sensory memory. After it hits your sensory memory, you may want to focus on something specific. Maybe you notice this person, and that goes into your working or short-term memory. Working in short-term memory is just holding onto that information for more than a few seconds. Maybe you notice that you're really bothered by this person's face, or you wonder why this person is so angry, so that it might be encoded again and stored into your long-term memory, where then you can later pull it out for retrieval. Your sensory memory, there are two main types of sensory memory, iconic and echoic. Iconic is going to be sight, so things that you see. Echoic is going to be things that you hear. In our sensory memory, there are times where we might focus more on certain information or not focus on certain information. One type is selective hearing. This is where you hear what you are focused on. So you may not hear mom call your name. And that has more to do with not that you couldn't hear her, but that you had selective hearing where you were paying attention or hearing only what you were focused on. Another type of selected focused attention that got cut off from the bottom here, I'm sorry, is what we call the cocktail party effect. So the cocktail party effect is when you can hear your name from across a busy room. So it's almost the exact opposite of selective hearing. Maybe you are talking to someone or you're engaging with somebody and you hear somebody say your name or say something that interests you across the room, and you can turn your focus over to that. So think of it as almost the exact opposite of the selective hearing. This I just thought was super interesting. Semantic is reading. It is a type of sensory memory. What we found, what they've done when they studied, is people who recognize a word, they found that just doing it visually, only just about 10% would recognize it. If you listen to it, about 60%. If you read it, it's almost closer to 90%. So think about if you are studying, including all of these things. So when you're doing something like Quizlet, you want to make sure you're reading through. You want to make sure you're listening to what they have to say. And you also want to make sure that you're looking at it. So you want to make sure that you are doing all of those types of information together to include the ability to process that information. Short-term versus long-term memory. So short-term memory, we said, is when you can store a short amount of things for a small period of time. We now consider this what we call working memory. You're going to see both terms used interactively, but working memory is a more updated, active version. And what they say is short-term memory is more of like a continuous process. So it doesn't just stay there for a couple seconds, but more like it's continuously working on things, it's continuously taking in information, processing it, and then determining whether or not you need to store it into long-term memory. Long-term memory is when you store information to be retrieved later, and how we do this is called encoding. So encoding is when you take stimuli and turn it into a form your brain can store. So you are storing information. There's two types of encoding. There's effortful encoding, which is what we see here, where we see somebody taking information or stimuli and turning it into a brain that you are turning it into a form your brain can understand. In this case, it might be studying, would be an example of effortful processing. So as I said, they have effortful. This is where you, for an example, might be to study. Okay. Automatic is something that happens automatically, right? Like how to get home from school. You may not have really been taught that, or you may have not spent a specific amount of time, especially if you've lived in this area for a long time, you just know how to get there, right? Or even how to get to McDonald's. Like, it's not something that you have spent time focusing on. It just happened automatically. Like, just by doing it, you've learned how to do it. Another way to encode is to overlearn. And this is where you've learned beyond memorization. It was funny, we just did the Constitution in U.S. history, and a lot of kids still know the preamble, right? So that might be an example of overlearning. Spacing effects. Another way to encode information. This is what I tell you all the time. Mass practice is learning all at once. Distributed practice is spacing it out over time. We know that distributed practice is going to be the most effective. Testing effect is exactly what it sounds. You test. We do find that this is effective for memory. It's a way to determine whether or not things have been stored. It is also a motivator. Okay. This curve over here, when it comes to studying or when it comes to encoding and information, is what we call the Ebbinghaus curve. The Ebbinghaus curve says that at the very beginning, when you first learn something, it may take you a long time. It may take you 20 minutes. But then, as you spend more time learning it, it may only take you 5 minutes to learn that same thing. So this is why we say distributed practice, is because yes, at the beginning it might take you a long time, but then if you spend time over a few days doing it, at the end it's not going to take you as long. Okay, how do we encode the information? The serial positioning effect says that we tend to remember things at the start and the end of a list. So recency is going to be the end. Primacy is going to be the start. Serial positioning factor says that we remember things at the end and start of a list. Now, something interesting with this, however, is that if you are trying to recall a list of information right away, this is true. You remember things at the beginning, or at the end. We see a huge drop in the middle, like words 4 through 8. People don't tend to remember, but they tend to remember 1, 2, and then even 9, 10, 11, and 12, right? This is immediate recall. However, later recall, you only remember the items at the beginning, right? 1, 2, 3. So what does this tell us? When you're studying for your Quizlet, as long as you're doing distributed practice over time, you want to make sure that you're spending your time on the middle and end words, not on the beginning words. You already know those. Now, Quizlet does shuffle them around, so that is super helpful. When we encode things visually, there's 2 ways that we encode it. Imagery, which makes sense, right? Like how we see things, or the actual aspect of pictures and seeing things as in a picture format, right? So when you're studying your vocab words, some people find using pictures helpful because it helps store that information. Mnemonics, Foolish Mom Smoke Pot, or even Roy G. Biv, as the colors of the rainbow, are ways to also remember information. We call that the peg word system, when the letters or words stand for other things. When we encode information, there are 2 ways to organize information once we store it. One way is by hierarchies, another way is by chunking. When we organize our information into hierarchies, we may have a category, and then we divide it into subcategories and then subcategories again. So here we have encoding. There's meaningful imagery and organization. In organization, there's 2 types. This is just a way that we organize information in our brain. Another type is by chunking, is by grouping information together. If you take a look at these 2 letters, they don't really make a whole lot of sense. And then if I try to take these letters and put them into with other letters, it still doesn't make sense. And if I take a look at number 5, I take those letters and turn them into words that I understand. Now I understand these words, but even remembering these sentences don't make sense. But if I chunk them into ways or formats that make sense to me, it's going to be easier to remember. So these letters are also seen down here. It's called Don't Take Any Wooden Nickels. 7 years ago, a stitch in time saves 9. So these are all little sayings. When you put them in this format, it's easier to remember because you're chunking content or information into ways that you are familiar with, that you can understand. And that is how we organize the information that we encode.